Our next two lectures will be with Dr. Mullin on advanced care planning and then palliative care for PAs with Bonnie Joy. Dr. Mullin is in hospice and palliative medicine in Olympia, Washington. Welcome, Dr. Mullin.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. Great. So I wanted to take an hour this afternoon to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart and is probably not something that you all think about all that often. But the idea that at some point in many of our patients' lives, they are not able to communicate their choices and wishes and values to us, their medical professionals, and with their families. And if we take some time ahead of time to talk about things that might be relevant at that crucial time, it can save a lot of pain and angst. So briefly, I'm a palliative care specialist. My primary board is in family medicine, so primary care is near and dear to my heart. I practice at St. Peter's Hospital in Olympia. I'm a palliative care consultant. My practice at this point is exclusively inpatient consultative work, and so I'm usually at the receiving end of a lot of these documents. And so I'm hoping that by taking some time to talk about it up front with people who are on the front lines like yourselves and educating people who are going to be on the front lines can hopefully smooth out transitions of care when people are desperately sick. So the objectives today, I'd like to define exactly what advanced care directives are, discuss the specific forms of advanced care planning that are currently available to patients in our community, discussing the legalities of these forms. There's often some misconceptions about what can be adhered to very closely and what is more of a guideline. Discussing what is decisional capacity versus legal competency in terms of who makes medical decisions and how do we determine that. If somebody is unable to make decisions for themselves, who is in line to be able to make those decisions for them? And then talking about some special circumstances where these kinds of issues can become quite crucial. So I'm going to try to figure out whether I'm preaching to the choir. How many people here have any idea what I'm talking about when I bring up the phrase advanced directives? Okay, cool. Then we're not going to belabor this too much. So this is a written form, typically, of communication that's intended to serve as a proxy for somebody's values and wishes if they are at a place in their life where they're so sick that they're unable to make choices and decisions for themselves. We commonly refer to this as advanced care planning, or ACP. We use this kind of language because it's also used for financial remuneration in terms of Medicare and Medicaid billing. This can be a formal legal document that is prepared with a lawyer and is notarized by a formal notary public, or it can be something extremely informal. So the first form that I think most of us are the most familiar with is called a POLST form, and that stands for Providers Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment, or portable orders for life-sustaining treatment. And I think that the really important key about this document is that these are providers' orders for medics. This is what a medic would use if 911 is called in the outpatient community. They're also kind of a benchmark or a guideline in terms of what kind of conversations have happened between a provider and their patient, and hopefully for family members to understand what the content and values of their wishes might be. But ultimately, this is a provider's orders. So this is actually a legal document in the outside world. So it gives a range of care preferences from full code or full treatment, which kind of means everything's on board. ICU level care, defibrillation, ACLS, intubation, pretty much anything that's going to sustain life. All the way to the other end of that continuum, which would be, don't touch me, leave me alone, let me stay home, which we would refer to as comfort-oriented care or comfort measures only. And then somewhere in the middle is, I think, where a lot of our patients who are very ill kind of end up, where they're like, well, if it's a UTI or something that I could handle very easily with a hospitalization, then sure, treat me. However, if it's a situation in which my death would be medically prolonged with ICU level care, then that's probably not something that I would want. So we call that selective treatments. So when we're talking about in the hospital, we refer to some people as no code or DNR/DNI. And what those represent is the idea that a person would not want that kind of ICU level care. That absolutely does not mean do not treat. It means that there might be some gray area there that we need to explore a little bit more. And having a POLST form on admission to the emergency department or to the hospital can be a red flag for providers on the inpatient side to think more critically about what kind of care are they offering. On the flip side of this form, there is a space in Washington State to discuss whether artificial nutrition, i.e. feeding tubes, would be something that a patient or family had strong opinions about. This isn't required, but some people do feel strongly about it, so being able to have a space to document that is important. This is what that form looks like. How many of you have seen this form in your work? Lots and lots. I wonder, can somebody just speak to what your experience is trying to fill this out in the outpatient world? Not enough time, okay. Anybody else? Sometimes the patient will have a hard time understanding things and family will kind of interject and then there's sort of this sub-discussion or argument that happens. Yes?
On the flip side, the family disagrees with what the patient wants, and they start bickering.
Or the family disagrees with what the patient has stated that they want and then they start bickering. Yeah, all of this sounds like Pandora's box, and having sat in your shoes, I understand. There's 15 minutes. I mean, come on, people, let's be realistic. So one little tip and trick that I find particularly useful in my work and in the work that I did as an outpatient, this is not an a la carte menu. If you approach this as you're going to sit down and say, okay, so part A, use of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, that's CPR. Yes, attempt resuscitation. No, do not. Which would you like? Is Pandora's box. You're going to get nowhere very quickly. Instead, I try to use this as sort of the end of the conversation, that over the course of days or years of getting to know a patient and family, being able to introduce these topics gradually and talking about what the success or likely failure would be of cardiopulmonary resuscitation in the outpatient setting with somebody with advanced heart failure, for instance. If you can get to a place where people have a pretty clear understanding of what their values would be in that situation, then offering this form as a way to codify that and filling it out ahead of time for them and being able to say, you know what, based on what we've talked about, you have told me that you are done with going to the hospital, that you'd really like to focus on your quality of life. You're happy to continue seeing me and taking the medications that you're on, but if something devastating happened, you would want your family to know that you wouldn't want to be taken to the hospital and put on a breathing machine. In that case, this form helps codify that wish, and then I would fill it out with them. Then I would ask them to take it home, read it over, talk it over with their family, and if they had more questions about it, to make a separate appointment to talk about those questions. How does that strike you guys? Do you guys have relationships with your patients that you think that might be helpful? Great. Maybe that'll save you a little bit of time and money. I'm going to pause and get some water. I'm realizing I'm extremely dry. I'm so sorry. Excuse me. Thanks, sorry about that. So a POLST form is not the only form that we see for advanced care planning. Other forms of advanced directives can include something called a living will. This was an idea that was popularized in the 1980s when we first started thinking about the idea that there wasn't an a la carte, one-size-fits-all in terms of care for patients that were very critically ill. People started writing out these ideas of what they would or wouldn't want. Largely, this idea came from the legal community. And a lot of the language around this involves what the legal definitions are in terms of capacity, incapacitation, terminal illness, attending physician, vegetative state. All of these concepts are actually very poorly defined from a medical standpoint. So in 1991, this was codified that said, from a federal level, that a person had the right to dictate what kind of care they would receive if they were at presumably close to the end of their life, and exactly how that was defined. The law also required that any facility that is admitting a patient who has a potentially life-threatening illness, i.e. you have to be hospitalized, must be asked if they have an advance directive. As I'm sure many of you are aware, this is very much a checkbox kind of situation nowadays. Unfortunately, the law didn't provide any kind of guidance in terms of what the content of that conversation needed to be. And so for all intents and purposes, today what that looks like is when a patient is being admitted or the family member is helping with the admission, they're asked by a clerk, do you have an advance directive? And if they say yes, they check a box that says yes. Do they actually provide it? No. Do they have any mechanism for providing it? No. And if they say no, then the next question is, would you like us to provide you information about an advance directive? And again, the answer yes, no. If they say yes, we would like some information, they're handed a very generic form that says, if you have wishes, please fill out this blank space. So not particularly helpful, but nonetheless, it does give an indication that our culture has decided that this is an important issue that we should probably try to address. Another form of an advance directive that I think is more interesting is something called an ethical will. How many of you have heard about this concept? Oh, great. Nobody, good. Okay, so an ethical will is more of a narrative. It's more of a literary approach, and it comes out of the Judaistic culture of trying to pass on the wisdom that you've achieved in your own life. One example of an ethical will is a poem called the Desiderata, some of you may have heard of. The idea is that you would want a person to be able to read this and hear something about who you were as a person, what your values were, what you were hoping that the next generation would understand about you, and if you weren't able to speak on your own behalf, what kinds of things mattered to you. So reading these, from my perspective, is such a gift because I hear the voice of the person who's not able to speak to me. And oftentimes they include things like who their children are, what kinds of professional accomplishments they've had that they're proud of, what kinds of tragedies have happened in their life, losses that they've experienced, what kind of challenges they've had to overcome and how they did that, and what they want the world to remember about them, what kinds of ways in which they feel that they've impacted the world and the community around them. These things are very interesting to read, both from a humanistic perspective, but also from a medical perspective. Because if I hear that a person is had a lot of experience with death and dying in their family and value human interaction and meaningful connection, and they have a neurologically devastating injury, that gives me a platform from which to start to speak to their family about, well, if this person was sitting here with us, what do you suppose that they would say about this situation? So an ethical will can be a very interesting exercise, both for the person writing it as well as for the people who end up experiencing it and hearing it. It's also a way of building legacy, which is something that we don't pay a lot of attention to in the medical world, but turns out is extremely important. So if you're taking care of somebody who is in the final stages of an advanced illness, whether that's a chronic illness like COPD or CHF, or they have metastatic cancer, either way, they're kind of looking down the barrel of realizing that they're near the end of their life. A lot of people are very interested in trying to figure out how do they leave their mark. And an ethical will can be one suggestion that you can provide for your patients and families as a consideration well before they end up in a situation where they're unable to speak to us or their family. So this is a little bit more information about the ethical will. Some practical considerations in terms of how long it is. You're, I think, all able to see these slides. If you're interested in looking more into it and providing this as a resource for your patients and families, please take a closer look at this slide. Another form that it's not really a form, it's more like a workbook that's commonly available is called 5 Wishes. How many of you have ever heard of this? Oh, good, handful, great. So 5 Wishes is a document that's for sale. So it's something that your clinic would have to be willing to buy. Patients and families can also get it online if they'd like to. It's inexpensive, it's a couple bucks, but nonetheless. And the idea is basically when a person is near the end of their life or has a very serious illness, there are essentially 5 topics that they need to be concerned with. Who makes medical decisions for them? what those medical decisions might look like in terms of what their choices would be, CPR, no CPR, et cetera. What kinds of treatments would they consider comfort? So being comfortable at the end of life is something that a lot of people espouse, and that does not mean the same thing to everybody. For how do you like medical information communicated to you and to your family? Are there people that you don't want involved in your medical information? Are there people that are spokespeople for the family even if they're not decision makers? And then finally, how do you wish to see your final death? Well, what does a good death look like to you? Again, a very personal question, not necessarily something that means the same thing to everybody. These are, as you can imagine, excruciatingly difficult conversations to have, both on a personal level and a professional level. I use this as a tool. I give it to patients and families as homework, something that they need to do for themselves. And I use it very explicitly in specific situations. This is not something that's going to be all that useful for my English as a second language Filipino family with 25 kids and a very collateral and group way of approaching decision making. This, however, might be a great tool for a 63-year-old former merchant marine who has a daughter as his primary person, but they don't really talk all that much about feelings. The way that it works is it goes through each of the topics and it gives statements in bullet points. If you agree with the statement, you can circle it. If you don't agree with the statement, you cross it out. And it's a way of engendering a conversation piece. It starts out pretty basic, like who's going to make decisions for me if I can't, and asks for a name and a phone number, et cetera. But it gets very intimate pretty quickly. In the section about what does it mean to be comfortable, one of the bullet points is one of my favorites. I wish to be rubbed with warm oil as often as possible when I'm in the final hours of my life. And a lot of people hear that and they're like, wow, yeah, that sounds great. I want to circle that. Me, personally, I'd take a Sharpie to it. Yeah, don't touch me. So it's just an example of how these things can be quite personal. In terms of the relational part of it, there's a section about, I wish to be forgiven for the things that I've done wrong in my life. I wish for my family members to resolve their disputes before I die. And having the personal experience of having gone through this with my mother, wow, that's some pretty big questions to open up and not necessarily something that I personally, as a palliative care doctor, would have done if I hadn't had a tool like this. So something to think about. So in terms of legalities, we're often confronted with the situation that was brought up of a family member, for instance, that doesn't agree with the POLST form as it was filled out by their parent, for instance. So the legality of these forms gets really messy really quickly. The pretty much only legal standing that this has, two instances. One, a POLST form is provider's orders for medics. And so if a medic shows up on the scene and there is a POLST form that says do not resuscitate and the person is pulseless and not breathing, then they have a legal standing to be able to say, I'm not doing anything here, I'm transporting a dead body. However, it is only as good as the surrogate decision maker. So if there's a POLST form that says do not resuscitate, do not intubate, and the patient is pulseless and breathless, and there is a person standing in the living room screaming, do something to the medics, they are legally obligated to do it. So all of these things are only as good as your family and surrogate's understanding of what your wishes would be, which leads to a lot of very complex situations. I see some nodding. I've got the feeling some people may have some experience with this. From the inpatient perspective, yes, go ahead.
Did you say that the paramedics would transport a dead body or not transport a dead body?
They might. It depends on the circumstances. So if a medic shows up and is called 911, the patient is clearly dead, and there is a DNR, DNI form, then they may transport them to the hospital to be kept in the morgue. It sort of depends on what the community standards are. Was there an underlying question there?
I just wasn't sure if you said they would or they wouldn't.
Oh, yeah.
I've been the provider doing CPR when the patient didn't live, and I wish that the paramedics would take the person, but they're like, oh, we don't transport dead people. So then I'm just trying to understand
Yeah, no, that's a good point. In my community, they would, and I understand perhaps that would be different based on the company. It's a good question. Thank you. So this gets murky when we start thinking about ethical wills, advance directives filled out by a lawyer, and post forms on the inpatient setting. How do we use these as a standard or a guide of practice when we're thinking about a novel situation that wasn't codified in the explicit literature that was provided? Basically, we don't. The idea is these are written wishes that hopefully have been communicated with a family. If I have these kinds of documents, when I sit down with a patient and family, for instance, if I have a patient that's in the intensive care unit who's intubated and is on pressors with metastatic cancer and is unlikely to survive this event, they have an advance directive that clearly says if two physicians, including one which is the attending physician, have certified that I have a terminal condition from which there is no chance of recovery, then I would not wish to have my life prolonged medically. Well, that's a real tricky statement, exactly how you define all of those. So I would sit down with the patient's family in this circumstance and say, look, I have this document here, and I'm really curious about this. This was filled out 10 years ago, prior to this diagnosis, prior to this event, obviously. What do you suppose was on her mind when she wrote this? What kind of scenario was she envisioning? And then we try to focus on what's colloquially called values-based shared decision-making. So the idea that the medical care that you receive is not cookie cutter. It's supposed to be appropriate for the person who's in front of you. And so these kinds of documents, while they can't be necessarily seen as the be-all, end-all binding directive, can be seen as a guidepost and as a way to spur a conversation about what a person's values are when they're unable to speak for themselves. So who needs advance directives? I mean, why are we even talking about this? Does it have to be somebody who is going to die very soon? And no, the general advice, particularly from Medicare and Medicaid in terms of wellness visits, is anybody over the age of 65 should be having these kinds of discussions. There's ways to be financially remunerated for that and ways to have more than a 15-minute visit in order to incorporate these kinds of advanced care planning discussions, because as pointed out, this can be Pandora's box. But certainly anybody who has a progressive terminal illness should probably start having these conversations. It's not a checkbox, it's not something to do once a year. It's something that should be incorporated into the narrative of your doctor-patient relationship as you begin to understand what your patient is trying to accomplish with their medical care. And by progressive terminal illness, I want to make sure that we're not just talking about people who have been diagnosed with ALS or with metastatic cancer. COPD is a progressive terminal illness. Congestive heart failure is a progressive terminal illness. Their prognosis, dementia, progressive terminal illness. Their prognosis may be on the order of years to decades. However, that just means you've got plenty of time to have these conversations, and hopefully an evolving awareness as a person moves through this part of being human, that you can help them understand what their values are and how that would impact the decisions that may be coming down the pike. People who have very specific ideas about the medical care that would be acceptable or not acceptable are also people who should have this codified. I think of the classic example of somebody who is Jehovah's Witness, for instance, who wouldn't accept blood product, or a person who feels very strongly that they would not accept ICU level care under any circumstance. People who value their autonomy and their independence so highly that they wouldn't accept hospital-level care. People like that. I think of one gentleman I know who's a schizoaffective sufferer. He's essentially a hermit and can't tolerate being in closed spaces with other people. It's important for the medical community to know that about this person if he's unable to communicate his wishes. So decision-making, who gets to make decisions? So we have two different ways of talking about who gets to make decisions in a medical capacity. One is decisional capacity, and the other is legal competency. So competency, to take that first and just get it off the table, is a patient who has lost the ability to make rational decisions for themselves, responsible decisions for themselves, in the eyes of a court. Once a person has been deemed incompetent legally, they are unable to make decisions that would be under the jurisdiction of the legalities. So they can't sign a contract, for instance. They are not able to manage their own finances typically. Those people have court-appointed payees or guardians who are responsible for making decisions for them. And that includes decisions about their health care. They are typically not under any obligation to make decisions that they feel are consistent with who the patient is as a person or what their wishes might be. They are empowered to make decisions as they see fit. So having a good relationship with somebody's guardian, if they lack legal competency, is very important in terms of being able to structure these conversations about what a person would or wouldn't accept and what would be appropriate medical treatment should they become very ill. I'm thinking of a particular case of a 63-year-old developmentally delayed man who I recently saw in the hospital who was admitted with sepsis after several weeks of not eating and not getting out of bed without seeking any medical care. Obviously, he's unable to speak for himself now. He's intubated and being transferred to the intensive care unit. And his guardian, when questioned about what his wishes would be under these circumstances and how far are we going to go, told me that he makes all of his own medical decisions for himself. Okay. So not particularly helpful in trying to determine what kind of medical care that person should receive. Decisional capacity is a much more interesting idea. Applebaum defined it as essentially having 4 criteria. This is an idea that people are able to make their own decisions and should make their own decisions up to a certain point, and it depends on what other circumstances are surrounding them. In our culture, from an ethical perspective, we value 4 different kinds of ethical principles: autonomy, justice, non-maleficence, in other words, do no harm, and beneficence, the idea of doing good. Any kind of medical decision that we're making, we try to make sure that we're hewing closely to those ethical principles. And autonomy in the United States culture tends to be pretty much up there in terms of what we try to value. However, if a person is unable to make really nuanced decisions for themselves, how do we respect their autonomy? How do we allow them that privilege? There's a continuum between therapeutic nihilism of, well, it doesn't really much matter what we choose. This person is going to do poorly, and so I don't really care. All the way to the other end of that, which is therapeutic optimism, which is, I see a red number I can turn black. I'm going to turn it black. Yes, I will. And somewhere in the middle is patient preference, right? And we try to use these conflicting forces to help us make medical decisions, or at least provide advice to patients and families about what we think would be the most appropriate medical care for them. And decisional capacity plays a big part in that in terms of patient preference. So we don't give antibiotics to a broken leg. I think we learned that in our last hour discussion. And in the same right, we don't necessarily just offer somebody CPR because that's what the family wants. We want to make sure that the medical care that they're offered makes sense for them. On the other hand, we don't just offer somebody a medical treatment because they ask for it, just because that's what their preference is. So the truth is going to have to be somewhere in the middle, and it's our job to help people figure this out. So decisional capacity waxes and wanes. It can change over the course of a day, it can change over the course of years, and it can change for the kind of decisions that a person is trying to make. So a person who's experiencing an MI at home who calls 911 and the medics show up and say, do you want me to take you to the hospital? Does that person in that moment, are they able to make a choice like that? I see someone shaking their head. Why do you say no? I'm going to call you out, I'm sorry. Yeah, so the comment was, it depends on how stable they are, and they're trying to make a decision under duress, right? So I like to say a lot of patients who are that sick can make decisions for themselves. They can decide if they want chocolate or vanilla pudding for breakfast, but they cannot decide whether they want life-sustaining treatments or not, because the intensity of the moment removes their ability to be rational about it. The same could be said about their relatives. So we try to think about decisional capacity in 4 different ways, as I alluded to, that Applebaum laid out in the 1980s. 1, a patient's ability to communicate a choice. A person who can't talk to you can't make their own decisions. Pretty basic, but it does make sense. This gets messy when they speak a different language and you can't understand them, or they are so dysarthric that you can't understand them, or they're nonverbal and you're using a speech board to try to figure it out. So there's an ethical component on our part to make every effort to figure out what a person is trying to communicate if they're able to. 2, a person has to be able to rationalize their choice. So they have to be able to understand the information that's being presented to them. They have to be able to make a rational choice with that understanding. And 3, they have to have an appreciation of the choice. So if a person says, no, you can't take me to the hospital, I'm just going to sit here with my oxygen saturations of 60%, and you can't make me. Does that person appreciate that they will eventually go into PEA arrest and die if they don't have further treatment provided for them? And is that consistent with their understanding and consistent with their rationalization? And if so, how do we honor that wish? And then lastly, they have to have some kind of internal logic behind this. So if a person is just like, yeah, I'm in clinic, I'm satting in the 60s, I refuse to allow you to take me to the hospital because I don't like you, that's probably not going to be a decision that I'm going to say they have the capacity to make. I'm going to pause there because that's a really important concept. Does anybody have any questions about that or thoughts? Yes.
It seems like in some situations this would be, like parsing these things out would be a lot to ask of the medic on the scene.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just a lot to, in the heat of the moment, to ask someone to try to figure out.
I absolutely agree with you, and it's why I have job security. In the absence of a clear pathway that tells us what to do, the default is full code, full treatment for everybody. Where there's life, there's hope. And we have lots and lots of ways of prolonging somebody's life medically, even if the outcome is assured, to buy us time to make sure that we're making the proper decisions and the right people are involved. In the moment, if you are in an emergency situation in the clinic, you have to rely very heavily on your understanding of what this patient's values are and trying to help figure out what the advice is that you're going to provide for them and their family. And that speaks to the richness of an outpatient practice, hopefully, that you have that opportunity for continuity to help guide these kinds of urgent situations when someone lacks the decisional capacity because of the overwhelming nature of it. Decisional capacity flows both ways, right? I may not have the capacity to make a choice for you because I don't fully understand all of the components because I don't have enough time. So the default position in those situations would always be to continue life-prolonging treatments until we have an idea of whether that's appropriate or not. It's a good point. Other questions or thoughts? Yes, sir.
What about some of those more elderly patients that make some of the decisions, but their actions don't necessarily reflect the understanding? You know, say an elderly person that would be willing to sit in a soiled diaper all day long and not agree to get washed or cleaned or go to the bathroom can still make choices as to what they want for breakfast.
Mm-hmm.
How do you gauge understanding that they're really grasping? How do you quantify that?
That's a great question and one that I encounter a lot in my work. And then I think it comes down to the stakes of the decisions, right? So if a person is choosing to stay in soiled undergarments, as you pointed out, because that's a reflection of their personhood and autonomy, their sense of the inviolability of their body and their independence is tied somehow to when and how they get touched and changed, then I would go out of my way to try to respect that person's personhood. However, if the decision was leading to self-harm, then we have a different kind of conversation. Do you understand the consequences of this, that it would lead to self-harm and further need for more care, for instance? If that person was rational and was able to tell me why they felt the way that they did, I would go out of my way to try to respect their personhood, as stated. However, if they can't really give me a good discussion about what it is that's the underlying principle there, if it's along the lines of a very concrete decision of yes, no, black and white, yes, that person, no, that person, I would lean more heavily on being more directive. I guess I kind of think about this in terms of not to minimize this, but in terms of children. I don't ask a 5-year-old when they would like to go to bed. However, if that person adamantly refuses to eat anything green, we might have more of a negotiation, right? It depends on the consequences of the decision. And I'm very curious when I run into something like that that seems contradictory. What is the underlying value that's pushing that? And how do I perhaps prop that up in a different way that's not directly confronting this particular aspect of care, but is more of a global penumbrum of what their values are and how they approach things? Does that help? It's a little vague, sorry. I think it gets to a very important point, which is that once we start talking about decisional capacity, we start getting very personal, both to the patient and family that we're dealing with, but also to the circumstance and the seriousness of the decisions being made. So we've figured out that this person can't make decisions for themselves, for whatever decision it is that we're trying to address. And how do we figure that out next? Who gets to make decisions for them? If you don't remember anything else from this talk, please, I implore you, every single one of your patients needs to have their surrogate decision maker codified in your EMR with correct contact information. Because when this becomes important, it becomes important very quickly, and it's often very difficult to unpack. So surrogacy is an interesting concept. It's often misconstrued as the decision maker, the person who is tasked with making a choice. I often encounter this in situations in the hospital where a family member is being asked to make a decision, for instance, about whether to continue a ventilator or to discontinue a ventilator and allow somebody to die. I have never in my career, nor would I ever, ask a person to make a decision like that on their own. That is absolutely inhumane to expect a person to make that kind of a weighty decision about another person's life based purely on their own judgment. However, we do need their input in terms of being able to figure out how to make the medical care that we're offering and providing match who that person is and what they value and what we're trying to accomplish. So I like the word surrogacy because it connotates the idea that you are speaking for somebody else with their voice, not with your substituted judgment, not with your ideas of what's right or wrong, but what you think they would say. And so for the instance of the person who pointed out in the office having a pulsed discussion with a patient and their family and them getting into it and arguing, that's an important conversation to have. And oftentimes, if I'm really kind of looking at the clock and like, okay, we're not going to have this conversation now, you guys, you can have it in the car on the way home. I might say, look, this is not about whether you agree with your mom about whether she would want to be intubated in an ICU. This is about what your mom wants and you understanding what she wants and why she wants it that way so that when she gets to a point that she can't talk to us, you can speak for her with her voice. And sometimes that really helps. It really lightens the tension in the room because, particularly if it's an emergency situation, being asked out of the blue to make a choice about life or death about somebody that you dearly love is impossible and incredibly traumatizing. And instead trying to say, well, if this person was sitting here with us at the table and heard all of this, what we're talking about, what do you suppose they would say? Is a much more ethical and supportable way of approaching that conversation. So the hierarchy in terms of like who gets to make decisions, it's not just whoever shows up at the bedside, as much as that would be very convenient for all of us. There are legal hierarchies in terms of the standards of who is legally able to make decisions. So in Washington state, it varies from state to state, the top is a legal guardian. So if a judge appoints a guardian to your care for health care decisions, that person trumps everybody else, including the medical community. So it behooves us to have a good relationship with our patients that have guardians and help them to understand medically what's happening with the person and what decisions might be coming down the pike. And then there would be a durable power of attorney for health care. How many people have dealt with this in the clinical setting? Just a handful, okay. So let's unpack that. So a durable power of attorney comes in two different flavors. One is for financial things and business. We have nothing to do with that, thank goodness. Healthcare decisions is a separate issue. And in Washington state, a person can designate anybody, it could be anybody, it doesn't matter what their relationship is with them, to be their power of attorney for healthcare decisions. They have to write this down on a piece of paper. That piece of paper has to be dated. They have to sign that piece of paper in front of two witnesses who are not financially related to them. So that can be Joe Schmo off the street, or it could be your two favorite cousins. It doesn't really matter, as long as it's not the person who's been named as the power of attorney and not a person who has a financial relationship, such as a caregiver. You can do that on a piece of paper. There's no special form that you absolutely have to have. Most hospitals have these kinds of forms, and if you Google them, Washington State Medical Association has them, blah, 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 blah. You can take it a step further, particularly if there are specific wishes that you wish to codify, such as artificial nutrition or more advanced care planning things, and you can have it notarized by a notary public. Again, you don't have to have a specific form. A notary public can notarize anything. The only thing that they are notarizing is not the validity of the form. They're notarizing your signature and that you signed something. So this is definitely something that can be handled in the outpatient world, either by going to a notary, a bank or whatever, or just, discussing this in clinic and going so far as to have a handout. People can nominate somebody. This becomes very important, and this is something that I try to share with all patients and families. In the absence of designating somebody as a power of attorney, we are left with the legal standard of the next of kin. And in Washington State, what that means is we go by, as you can see, the levels of relatedness, starting with a person's spouse or domestic partner, their adult children, their parents, brothers and sisters, on and on and on, down to, with very recently added to the Washington State law, RCW 7.70.065, which says that a person who is familiar with the patient can act as a surrogate decision maker if there is literally nobody else and if they are willing to accept that responsibility. And there's a special form for them to sign. This usually happens in the hospital with somebody who is otherwise non-decisional and unbefriended. And this may be somebody that they know from the street, for instance, or their drinking buddy. And if that person feels that they know the patient well enough to be able to offer an informed conversation about what their values would be to help us with medical decision making, we have a legal recourse to be able to use them as a default decision maker. The caveat here, which I think is very important, I don't know about your families, but this would matter in mine, the person who is at the level of surrogacy, all people at that level are equally involved. So for instance, if you're unmarried, or gosh, if you were married and are separated and haven't spoken to each other in 20 years but are still married, that's a fun one. But let's say you don't have a spouse, but you have 6 children, none of whom speak to each other. It's super awesome. You're unable to talk to us. You're in a car accident. Now we're looking for a legal decision maker. All 6 of those kids are equal decision makers and must come to consensus before we can make any medical decisions. And this is also why I have job security. So for some of you who are taking care of patients who have more complex family dynamics, this might be an interesting point that they might want to take care of this if they want to avoid some very complex situations. Yeah, Bonnie. What up, what up? Nope. Okay. Speak up.
Hello. Okay. So I don't know if you know the answer to this, and I think I might, but I'm not sure, because I had a patient in primary care a few years ago who was elderly, and he lived in a nursing home, and he would leave and wander away and end up at our clinic for a kind of a strange reason. Maybe it was valid, maybe it wasn't. And his power of attorney, or his durable power of attorney, was his son. He had 2, actually. And they really didn't seem like they had much care to provide or interest in showing up to appointments that were regularly scheduled with this patient. As a PA and their primary care provider, how would you deal with that kind of situation? And what kind of conversation would you have with the family to try to help reorganize and restructure the relationship if you can? Or is this like an adult protective services situation?
Yeah.
I'm not really sure. It seems like a very big gray area to me.
Yeah, it's a wonderful example. I have a couple of clarifying questions. Does this person have decisional capacity?
No.
No, okay.
Diagnosis of dementia.
Okay, and this person, I'm presuming, filled out power of attorney paperwork prior to their...
Correct.
Okay, so you're stuck.
Okay.
They can't change their power of attorney if they can't legally make decisions for themselves, like signing a contract. So the, oh, look at this. This is service, you guys. So you are kind of stuck. However, the first line of Anna Karenina, it says, all happy families are alike, and all unhappy families are unique. So there's a letter of a law, and then there's also the spirit of the law. And so being able to talk to the person who is the power of attorney and say to them, listen, this does not seem to be your bag. You're busy dealing with whatever life crisis you've got going on, and your brother seems to be a reasonable human being who is willing to participate in these conversations. How do you feel about that? And they say, yes, please include my brother. You talk to the brother, and the brother says, absolutely, that's totally fine. Then you go with it. The problem comes up when there is disconnection in the family in terms of, brother A and brother B are not speaking to each other. Brother A is making terrible choices, but is the legal decision maker. Brother B would like to be involved, but is getting blocked out of that situation, at which point I call risk. It's a great question, though. Largely, I try to head things off as far in advance as you can. So if you have somebody who has a diagnosis of vascular dementia and they are at a stage where they're starting to wander but can still do, basic things like fold socks, getting ahead of things at that point and saying, look, the average prognosis from this point in dementia to when somebody finally dies, if nothing else happens, is on the order of, years, like 3 to 5 years, roughly. We don't have to have this conversation now, but you guys need to know what's coming down the pike so that ultimately I have an idea of how to advise you when I see that we're getting to those stages. Does that make sense to you? Sometimes we don't have that luxury, but you guys have more of a chance at having that kind of continuity relationship than people who are in the inpatient setting. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure what people's awareness is of adult protective services, so let's start with that. So we have two public health agencies that help protect vulnerable individuals in our society: Child Protective Services and Adult Protective Services. They are very different. Child Protective Services is empowered to remove children from vulnerable situations and place them into supportive environments as a last resort. They really do everything that they possibly can to try to keep family units intact, even when the situation is less than desirable. Adult Protective Services doesn't necessarily have that authority. So their job is more to come alongside of a vulnerable situation and see what kind of community resources could be applied to the situation to help make it sustainable for the patient and family to be able to muddle through on their own. If it got to the point that a person was totally not decisional and the family was, for instance, exploiting them financially, or there was some kind of secondary gain issue, the courts can get involved, but it almost always has to start from a criminal complaint. And so it's a very long, drawn-out procedure. If a person, for instance, is in the hospital and is non-decisional and unbefriended, which is actually very, very rare, there are not a whole lot of humans in that category, the hospital becomes legally responsible for their care. Not going to discharge them, they're kind of stuck. In which case, the hospital would initiate a guardianship process. Typically takes 90 days or more to have a court-appointed guardian. That person obviously is just, it's a job. It's a court-appointed position. They don't necessarily know a whole lot about it. And the hospital becomes financially responsible for that person until the guardianship process has been completed. So as you can imagine, people do a lot to try to avoid that situation. So there's a mixed feeling about APS as being both helpful and supportive, in the sense that if you have a vulnerable family member that you're very worried about, getting them involved is almost never a bad thing to do, because hopefully they'll be able to bring something to bear. And a little frustrating, because ultimately if the problem is entrenched, it's going to take a lot of leverage to be able to try to ameliorate the situation before it reaches the level of getting to the hospital where somebody is legally responsible for the care of that person. And that can be very frustrating from an outpatient perspective, that you watch this person coming back in and getting more and more frail, and you're very worried about their safety. There's another organization in King County, at least. It's called the GRAT, Geriatric something team. Our reaction, GRAT. Now, I'm sorry, I just blanked on it. That sort of helps fill that gap in terms of they have a voluntary assessment of a person's vulnerabilities, and then they can align community resources, including volunteer resources, to try to help provide a layer of support that would hopefully head off having to have an APS referral. So I think it's important to know what your community resources are. Hopefully you have a social worker in your clinic. I mean, it's aspirational. That could help you with some of these issues. But if you do see somebody that you're very worried about, APS would not be a bad thing to think about. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's where the power of attorney paperwork comes in. So you can, as I said, there are forms that you can fill out, or you can just write this out. And as long as it's witnessed and you signed it, it is legally binding. So if for instance, I've got 3 siblings, 2 parents, and a spouse, none of whom should be involved in making medical decisions on my behalf. I love them dearly. They're not going to be able to do that. Yeah. So I've explicitly written out in my personal paperwork, in case I get into a crash on I-5 on the way home, that I have a friend who is a physician who I've designated as my power of attorney, and explicitly said my family members are not allowed to be included in medical decision making. However, they are able to have access to medical information. And it's another reason to bring it up with your patients and families, because all unhappy families are unique. And there are going to be situations like that where Uncle Tom from Alaska definitely should not be involved. It's a good question. Okay, so some caveats. We've already sort of touched on these in terms of all the people at the same level are the ones that are legally responsible in the absence of documentation explicitly stating otherwise. Family members can defer to each other. It's not uncommon to have a big, complex family who says, cousin Diane is the one who's actually living here. She's the person that you need to call if things happen, and then we'll talk about it as a family. Close friend, we've already talked about. Oh, God. And then recently, this is just within the last couple of weeks, it used to be that a patient who verbally designated a decision maker to 2 providers on separate occasions that were documented in the medical record, that would stand as a de facto decision maker under duress or under extenuating circumstances. And that has been legally challenged and is now no longer a standard in Washington state. So if you've got Joe Schmo, who's always brought in by his loving daughter, Karen, to all of his appointments. He is demented. Karen has been the one who's been participating. He ends up going into the hospital, and Karen is at the bedside, and somebody says, "Do you have a power of attorney?" And she says, "No." And they say, "Well, do you have any siblings?" And she says, "Yeah, I've got 4 in Taiwan." We're kind of stuck. So again, being able to talk about this stuff ahead of time in the outpatient world is of deep importance if people want to make sure that the care that they get aligns with who they are as a person and what they would actually want. So, yes, sir.
Would that include sort of the Medicare annual wellness visit? Mm-hmm. And then ask them to list a decision maker,
Mm-hmm.
surrogate decision maker, and that's a signed document.
Yep.
My understanding is that has no legal.
Nope, it's a guidepost. Yeah, which, as up until a couple of weeks ago, that plus another conversation with another provider that was documented would have been enough legally for us to stand on. And now there's case law that says that that's not the case. And I'm not a lawyer, but obviously I get to be on the receiving end of a lot of this. So that's a good question. So that wellness visit is a good clue, or prompt for us as providers to say, I can see that you want to designate your daughter Karen. However, I know you've got other kids, and so if this is in truth what you would like, we need to take it a step further to make it official. So, special circumstances, time check. Where are we? I'm sorry, I didn't wear a watch. Oh, terrific. Well, then we'll wrap this right up. So what happens if you can't find a decision maker? So in the absence of anybody, just, John Doe shows up in the emergency department in a motor vehicle accident, intubated in the field, is very, very sick, and we're desperately trying to figure out who they are and what to do next. There's something called LexisNexis. Has anybody heard of this? I see one person nodding. That's great. So this is an electronic footprint. This is basically the idea that everybody is connected to the interwebs in some way or another. It is it's extremely rare, in fact, that somebody has no electronic footprint. And so if you look back far enough, you can find levels of relatedness to other individuals from the interwebs. And they'll generate a bunch of names of people who have either similar family names, similar backgrounds, lived at the same address, worked at the same workplace. Yeah, it's actually kind of scary how good it is. And then the hospital starts going through them and cold calling people and saying, hey, do you know Joe Schmo? Obituaries, just running a Google search and looking for obituaries for a family name, particularly if it's somewhat unusual, can turn up a lot of connected relationships. Collateral informants, the person who was in the car with them, using the good old Google. And in the old days, in the before times, using Facebook Messenger was a novel way of approaching this that I thought was pretty crazy, but that whoever was searching could set up a fake profile or a temporary profile and try to send a message to people that they thought could potentially be relatives or collateral informants of a person, and if they would choose to respond. So as I alluded to, non-decisional unbefriended people are actually very rare. If we've learned nothing else from the pandemic, it's that human beings are intimately connected with each other. So if you have a patient that you've never had this conversation with, who you truly think is very isolated, take a little bit of time to dig a little bit deeper, because chances are very good that they have a neighbor, they have a drinking buddy, they have a food bank worker, they have a methadone clinic provider, they have somebody in their life that knows them and knows something about them that could help with medical decisions if they needed to. And if that person is truly uninterested in having other participants in their life, reminding them that if they don't designate somebody, that this is what we're going to do to find somebody, can sometimes be a prompt to help them make these decisions ahead of time. So in the absence of that, last point, if we are in a situation where providing medical care is not going to change the outcome, is, the parochial term is flogging somebody in the ICU. I'm sure we've all sort of had this experience or heard about this, medically keeping somebody alive past the point that it's humane or beneficial. Most states have some kind of a legal definition of what non-beneficial care is. This can get very, very murky. It depends very much on the providers involved having the courage of their own convictions and having consensus in the medical group. But should that consensus be built and be documented in the medical record with the attending provider and a consulting provider, along with nursing documentation, that all efforts have been made to reach somebody for medical decision making and that the care that we're providing is no longer beneficial to the patient, then legally we have the authority to stop. I will say it's pretty rare. If you did find yourself in a circumstance like that somehow, I would highly urge you to get an ethical community involved. All hospitals have a JCO requirement to have an ethics committee. Of course, JCO doesn't actually specify what that means. So it varies widely in terms of its usefulness. But at the very least, as a provider, if you're at the forefront of this kind of decision making, you want to make sure that you have as much support as possible. So with that, I bring this to a close. Thank you so much for your participation and questions. If you have more questions afterwards, I'll be around.